Right, so we're going to talk about extinction and punishment in this slideshow. So extinction is any time that you're no longer providing reinforcement for behavior. So it basically means that behavior was previously reinforced and you're no longer going to provide reinforcement for it. So you're not going to necessarily punish it, you're just not going to reinforce it anymore. And it's really important when you think about extinction to remember that behaviors can serve multiple functions, which means basically that they can have multiple sources of reinforcement. And it's really important to try to knock out all the potential sources of reinforcement for that reinforcer. And also to remember that you really only need to withhold the reinforcement that's maintaining the behavior. So if the behavior is not being maintained by attention, you don't necessarily have to not provide attention to the child. So this isn't kind of your life sucks because you're misbehaving. This is just you aren't going to get what you want because you're misbehaving. Briefly to review, I know you spent 45 minutes talking about this, so just very briefly, the four functions of the behavior are attention, access to the tangible, escape avoidance, or automatic reinforcement. So when you provide when you're going through extinction, it's really important to note that you are most likely going to encounter an extinction burst. So an extinction burst always or very frequently follows the beginning of an extinction procedure, and it basically means that the behavior gets very, very bad and then it gets better. So it's really important when you are going through this to plan for the extinction burst and to let the people in the environment know that before the behavior gets better, it might get worse. And you might see an increase in variability, meaning that before the kid might have just been throwing things, and now you run extinction and the kid is now throwing things and running around the room and screaming. So there's an increase in the variability of the behaviors. You might see emotional behavior, so kind of an increase in angry behavior, an increase in the expression of anger. You might see an increase in aggression. You might see what's called resurgence, meaning that behaviors that you had previously extinguished and taken care of come back. And then it might also cause depression if it goes on long enough. I think that when you're thinking about an extinction burst, a really helpful thing to think about is a breakup, because in breakups, we really do see a strong extinction burst, especially right after the breakup occurs. So this is a brief video from Super Nanny about a extinction burst in real life. So sad. Did you finish recording?
Come on, man. Try again. Try again, man.
One more time.
Come on, one more time.
Film it, man.
What happened?
This one here stole my candy.
Ah, fuck. Come on, take
Last
it.
one.
Get it.
Come on, man.
Yeah, man.
Sure.
How much did it steal from you? How much did it steal from you?
$3, $4.
Now you got the money, man.
What, 20 cents? It's only 20. Hold on, I think I got it. Come on, man.
It's gonna work now, or?
Kick it too many times. Ah, come on. Give me the second one.
You got it, man.
So as you can see from that video, when the man didn't get the reinforcement from putting the money in the vending machine that he was expecting, he then kind of responded with an extinction burst. So he started kicking the machine and cursing at the machine and doing other things to try to get candy out of the machine. And this video is a really good illustration of how you shouldn't reinforce an extinction burst, because next time in the future that the man encounters a situation where he can't get the money out of the machine, he's going to immediately resort to kicking it because it's worked for him in the past. So the factors that impact the extinction burst are, first, the history of reinforcement that the person has. So if they're used to getting reinforced for their actions and then they all of a sudden don't get reinforced, that's going to be a much bigger extinction burst than if a person is not really sure if what they're doing is going to cause reinforcement in the first place. Also, how much reinforcement is available. So if there is $10 billion available for this, if the person is able to be successful during the extinction burst, that's going to be a much worse burst than if there's only a couple of dollars. Also, the degree of deprivation that the person experiences before the extinction protocol is put into place. So if the person is really hungry and they're throwing a tantrum to get food, they're going to be much more likely to have a worse extinction burst than if they just ate dinner. Their previous experience with extinction, so if they have had many experiences where they had gone through the beginnings of extinction and then they started to make their behaviors worse and then they got reinforced, the next extinction burst is going to be much worse. And then the absence or the presence of a discriminative stimulus. So sometimes extinction bursts are environmentally dependent. So maybe they know that when mom is in the room, their extinction burst is going to work, but when dad is in the room, their behaviors are not going to work. And so sometimes people can modify their behaviors based on discriminative stimuli in the environment. Effective extinction is when you withhold all reinforcement for all problem behaviors, and you withhold it consistently. So there's no possible way that the person can get reinforcement from engaging in those problem behaviors. It should also be combined with reinforcement for other behaviors. So you're teaching a replacement behavior while you're extinguishing the problem behavior, and that replacement behavior is something that will allow the person to get what they want. You should always explain what's happening so that way the person knows exactly how to get the extinction procedure to end and exactly how to get what they want. You should plan for the extinction burst. You should increase the number of trials. So you should run as many extinction protocols as you can, and you should include as many people as possible to maximize your chance of generalizing it. Spontaneous recovery is just the reappearance of an extinguished response following a rest period after extinction. So this means that something has actually been extinguished and then there's a pause between that extinguishment and the next time, and there tends to be a spontaneous resurgence of the behavior that has been extinguished. This also occurs if you extinguish something in one environment and then the person's put in a new environment, and something in the new environment might trigger those extinguished behaviors. So a good way to think about spontaneous recovery is to think about your feelings right after a breakup. So before a breakup, you were really reinforced by the other person, and during the breakup, that kind of reinforcement from the other person was put on extinction. And then after a breakup, you go through this really long period of extinction, and then you feel better, you no longer are in love with that person, you no longer expect reinforcement from that person, and then just seeing that person in a grocery store could make all of those feelings of love and expecting reinforcement come back. So that's what spontaneous recovery is. And again, it's really important to remind people of this because sometimes they feel like their kids are regressing or they feel like the extinction didn't work, and this is actually something that we should expect to see when extinction is done. So moving on to punishment. Punishment differs from extinction because we are actively trying to decrease the behavior by doing something. So we're not just withholding reinforcement, we're adding something or taking something away from the environment to decrease the behavior. So there are two different types of punishment. There's negative punishment, which is when we take something away. So if you ground someone, you put someone into a timeout, etc. And then there's positive punishment, which is when you add something to the environment. So this could be spanking, this could be giving someone more chores, things where you're adding something to the environment to make a behavior decrease. So what are some things that are punisher? You might say spanking, you might say grounding, you might say taking away an iPad, you might say taking away car keys. There's a really long list, but it's really important to remember that this is kind of a trick question. There's not an exhaustive list of things that are punishers. Punishers are defined by their impact on that specific person's behavior. So a punisher really is anything that decreases behavior. And I like to always spend some time here and talk about the fact that behavior modification is supposed to work. So if you are punishing someone and the behavior is not decreasing, then you're not actually punishing them. Punishers decrease behavior always. And it's really important to remember that, again, the punisher is defined by the impact of the stimulus on the behavior. It's not defined by whether you think that the punishment is good or bad. So when I was little, I used to love to read, and my parents would take away books from me whenever I was bad. And to somebody outside looking in, they might not say that taking away books is a bad thing. They might be like, that kid doesn't care, that kid's going to go play on an iPad or go play outside. But for me, that was a bad thing. So punishers, again, are really individualized to the person. So sometimes yelling at a child for doing something bad is actually not punishing that child because the child wanted attention in the first place. So when you're using punishment, you should be looking at whether or not the behavior is decreasing, and if it's not decreasing, you need to use a different punisher. So there are many, many drawbacks to punishment, which is why as behavior analysts, we really try to use reinforcement before punishment whenever possible. And even when we are using punishment, we try to combine it with reinforcement to kind of address some of these drawbacks. So the first really big drawback is that there is no replacement behavior. So you're just punishing bad behavior, but you're not teaching the person how to get what they want in a good way. And this might mean that the person is now going to develop another bad behavior to get what they want. Punishment also does not generalize well. So reinforcement tends to generalize across environments. Once somebody learns that one action will get them reinforcement in one environment, they're very likely to expect that it will get them reinforcement in a different environment. Punishment is not like that. Once somebody learns that something is going to be punished in one environment, they start looking for discriminative stimuli to indicate the punishment, and they don't generalize it across settings. So for example, somebody might learn that when dad is home, I get punished for screaming, but they're not necessarily going to think that, oh, screaming is a bad thing, and no matter what the situation is, they're just going to stop screaming when dad's home. And this also can cause avoidance or resentment of the punisher. I mean, I think if you think of all the times in life that you've been punished, you'll kind of feel, or you'll look back and see that you felt resentment towards the person who's punishing you. And so this is really important to talk about with parents, because you don't want parents to have children who are resentful of their parents. You know, you want like a nice family atmosphere. And sometimes when kids misbehave all the time, what ends up happening is they spend the majority of their interactions with their parents being punished. And that, of course, is really bad, and it's really, really sad. And so when you're talking to parents, you want to make sure that they're providing equal opportunities for punishment and for reinforcement in their interactions with their kids to kind of avoid that. Punishment may also cause a very strong emotional response, and it may result in aggression. And when people use punishment as a form of control over other people, they're telling other people that it's okay to control others through punishment. So when a parent spanks a child to get the child to behave the way that the parent wants, they're communicating with that child that in the future, when somebody else is not behaving the way that you want them to behave, it's okay to hit them. And that might interfere with how the child is reacting with their peers or with their spouse or with their children in the future. And punishment is innately reinforcing to the punisher. So punishment tends to work if it's done correctly. And that tends to lead the punisher to do it more often for different behaviors. And so it might lead to an increase in punishment because the first punishment works so well. Benefits to punishment is that it's quick and dirty, and it works if it's done correctly. So it can actually decrease inappropriate behavior, especially inappropriate behavior that cannot keep occurring, so aggression or self-injurious behavior. It can also help to improve the person's mood, especially if you're punishing, again, behaviors that lead to a decrease in mood, so self-injurious behavior, or maybe if you're punishing someone for eating unhealthy. And it can also improve their attention to the environment. So if they are being punished for walking the street because you're yelling stop, 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 in the future they might be more likely to look before they walk in the street, so it can help keep people safe. When you're using punishment, what you want to make sure is that it's immediate. So punishment should immediately follow the behavior that it is punishing every single time. You also want to make sure it's intense. So sometimes people will escalate punishment. So they'll say, if you do that, you're going to have to sit here in timeout for 1 minute. And the kid does that. And they're like, well, don't do it again, or you'll have to sit here in timeout for 2 minutes. That's not good. You need to start with the most intense form of punishment that you're planning on using and give it right away. You also need to make sure that it's consistent. So punishment needs to follow every single time that behavior occurs in order to be effective. So speeding tickets, which don't occur every single time that behavior occurs, are clearly not effective for that reason, because you know that sometimes when you speed, you might get ticketed, and sometimes when you speed, you might not get ticketed. You also should offer the person an explanation for why they're being punished. You should explain the rationale behind it. And it's always better to use negative punishment, i.e. take something away, than it is to use positive punishment and kind of put something on to someone else. And you should always combine punishment with a reinforcement for replacement behavior. So you should be teaching the person the correct thing to do by reinforcing a replacement behavior rather than just punishing the bad behavior. Why do we need to teach a replacement behavior? So it's really important to remember that all behavior is rational, no matter what. That means that the individual is behaving in a specific way in order to access a specific thing from the environment. They're not behaving in a certain way because that's how they feel that day, or because they're hungry, or because they're thirsty, or because they have autism. They're behaving to get something from the environment. And sometimes it might be hunger, or sometimes it might be food, and sometimes it might be a drink, but we need to remember they're not behaving that way because they're hungry. They're behaving that way to get food. And again, the 4 functions of behavior are access to the tangible, escape avoidance, attention, and automatic reinforcement. So even if we punish the behavior that the individual is doing, they're still going to want whatever they wanted before we punish the behavior. So if a kid's throwing a tantrum to get food, after we punish the behavior, he's still going to want food. And this means that the kid is going to try a new way to get what he wants. So he's going to try a new way to get food. And that new way that he tries could be appropriate or inappropriate. So replacement behavior is going to supply the kid with a way to get what he or she wants while still behaving in a way that you think is appropriate. So you're going to let them have what they want. You're just going to teach them a better way to get it. And so when you're thinking about a replacement behavior, you want to make sure that your replacement behavior is easier to do than the behavior that you're trying to decrease. So if your replacement behavior for getting candy is that the kid has to clean the entire house, or they can throw a tantrum, you're going to want to, that's not going to be effective. They're just going to go back to throwing a tantrum. So you want to make sure that your replacement behavior requires less time, less effort, less energy than whatever the person was doing in the first place. And you also want to make sure that it serves the same function as the behavior that you're trying to decrease. So you're allowing the individual to gain access to what he or she wants. So if a kid is screaming to gain attention and you teach them that instead of screaming, they should just go play on an iPad, that's not going to be an effective replacement behavior because the kid was screaming to get your attention and your replacement behavior allows them self-stimulation. And you also want to make sure that whatever replacement behavior you choose to teach them is going to be reinforced even when you're not there. So you want a replacement behavior that's going to gain them reinforcement even in the natural environment. And you want them to be able to gain reinforcement that is larger than the amount of reinforcement gained from engaging in problem behavior. So if the kid knows that if I tantrum, I can eat as many cupcakes as I want, or I could ask for a cupcake and my mom's going to give me half of the cupcake, they're going to keep throwing the tantrum. So you want to make sure that you're providing access to reinforcement that's larger than what they would get if they were doing the problem behavior. So, when should you use punishment? The short answer is you rarely want to use punishment. The BCBA, they say that we should try every method of reinforcement and prove that's not effective before we try a punishment situation. So the first big thing that you should do is have a conversation with your program consultant. And if they tell you to, you should make sure that you're able to implement punishment consistently across people and settings. So if you're going to be able to punish the behavior, but mom and dad are not going to punish the behavior, then punishment really isn't going to be an effective thing in that situation. And you also want to make sure that you have a plan for using reinforcement for replacement behavior. So punishment always goes in conjunction with reinforcement. And the last thing that we're going to talk about is what to do if you think that the parent is physically punishing the child. So we know that physical punishment is not necessarily the most effective form of punishment. And so we're ethically obligated to kind of step in and talk to the parents about this. So if you think that physical punishment is happening, you want to tell your PC about it. Even if it's just physical punishment that is not child abuse. If you think that physical punishment is happening to the impact that it is child abuse, you also need to talk to your program consultant, and then there are different steps. But if it's just the parent is spanking the child regularly, you need to talk to the PC about it. And you should not be using physical punishment yourself. So even if the parent is controlling all the behaviors in the house through spanking, do not engage in spanking behavior. And then your PC or you will explain to the parents why we use reinforcement instead of punishment to kind of help educate them and allow them to make educated choices about how they're doing behavior modification with their children. Again, we're not necessarily telling parents that they're wrong for spanking their kids. We're just making sure that we're informing them about the components of effective punishment, about the dangers of using physical punishment, and then about why you need to use punishment in conjunction with reinforcement. So that is the punishment and extinction PowerPoint. If you have any questions, you can ask.